good to see you. You know the drill.
Thank you very much, Chairman Scott, for holding today's hearing and for your interest in the Tribal Law and Order Act and for allowing me to testify in support of this legislation. I want to thank Mr. Lundgren for his comments and his understanding and perspective as it relates to the impact of law enforcement across the country and the different tribes that we represent. As South Dakota's lone member of the U.S. House of Representatives, I have the privilege of representing 9 sovereign Sioux tribes. The Tribal Law and Order Act is a bipartisan and bicameral initiative to improve coordination among tribal, state, and federal law enforcement agencies and increase accountability standards. Senator Byron Dorgan, who is chairman of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, has introduced nearly identical legislation in the Senate that's been approved by the committee. And President Obama announced at the Tribal Nations Conference held in Washington, D.C. here last month that, quote, I support the Tribal Law and Order Act and look forward to Congress passing it so I can sign it into law. I'd especially like to thank the U.S. Department of Justice and Attorney General Holder for the priority the department has given to tribal justice issues. The department held a Tribal Nations listening session on public safety and law enforcement in Minneapolis in October and other places across the country, which together with the Tribal Nations Summit in Washington, D.C., and DOJ's ongoing efforts to work with Congress to fashion the very best tribal law and order bill, that demonstrates the President and his administration's commitment to working with tribes on law enforcement priorities that we share in common. I'm very glad to see that Associate Attorney General Tom Borelli is here today to testify, and I thank him for all of the initiative and attention that he himself has given and devoted to these issues throughout his career, including speaking at the listening session in Minneapolis and the Tribal Nations Summit. I'm particularly pleased at his candor that the federal government must do better and that he has experience working with large land-based tribes like the Oglala Sioux tribe in South Dakota. As you know, the federal government has a unique relationship with the 562 federally recognized American Indian and Alaska Native tribes. This government-to-government relationship is established by our founders in the U.S. Constitution, recognized through hundreds of treaties, and reaffirmed through executive orders, judicial decisions, and congressional action. Fundamentally, this relationship establishes the responsibilities to be carried out by one sovereign to the other. Native American families, like all families in our country, deserve a basic sense of safety and security in their communities. Law enforcement is one of the federal government's trust obligations to federally recognized tribes. Yet, as the tribes across the country know all too well, on many counts, we are failing to meet that obligation and have done so for too many years. For instance, as the chairman noted in his opening remarks, Amnesty International has reported that American Indian and Alaska Native women are more than 2.5 times more likely to be raped or sexually assaulted than women in the United States in general. Yet the majority of those crimes go unpunished. Moreover, fewer than 3,000 law enforcement officers patrol more than 56 million acres of Indian country. That reflects less than 1/2 of the law enforcement presence in comparable rural communities. The situation is particularly challenging, as I think Mr. Lundgren noted, for large land-based reservations in South Dakota and elsewhere. The kinds of problems that arise include the case of a young woman living on the Pine Ridge Reservation who had received a restraining order for an ex-boyfriend who had battered her. One night she was home alone and woke up as he attempted to break into her home with a crowbar. She immediately called the police, but due to a lack of landlines for telephones and spotty cell phone coverage, the call was cut off 3 times before she could report the situation to the dispatcher. The nearest officer was over 40 miles away. Even though the police officer who took the call started driving her home at 80 miles an hour on roads that the quality of which, well, if you traveled those roads, you would understand why traveling even over 60 miles an hour is a hazard in the high incidence traffic accidents that we have and deaths that result. But even with his efforts, by the time he arrived, the woman was severely bloodied and beaten and the perpetrator had escaped. In addition to the situations faced by victims of violent crime, these officers frequently have no backup. And again, just to put the expansive nature of this territory into perspective, just the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe that I represent, the reservation, is comparable to the size of the state of Connecticut. The Tribal Law and Order Act would improve law enforcement efforts in Indian country by clarifying the responsibilities of federal, state, tribal, and local governments with respect to crimes committed in tribal communities. It would increase coordination and communication among federal, state, tribal, and local law enforcement agencies. It would empower tribal governments with the authority, resources, and information necessary to effectively provide for the public safety in tribal communities, reduce the prevalence of violent crime in tribal communities, and combat violence against Indian and Alaska Native women. It would target youth prevention by authorizing funding for summer education programs and at-risk youth treatment centers, address and prevent drug trafficking and reduce rates of alcohol and drug addiction in Indian country, and increase and standardize the collection of criminal data and the sharing of criminal history information among state, federal, and tribal officials responsible for responding to and investigating crimes in tribal communities. One example of an improvement the bill would make is the provision for special law enforcement commissions. Currently, only federal agents, such as the FBI, can make arrests for rapes on reservations in cases in which the perpetrator is non-Indian. In many cases, those FBI officers can be hundreds of miles from a reservation. A provision in this bill would expand a training program to give special law enforcement commissions to tribal law enforcement officers. With a special commission, a tribal law enforcement officer can be federally deputized to arrest any person on tribal land who commits a federal crime such as rape, murder, or drug trafficking. The bill also streamlines the process for IHS officials to testify in criminal cases such as rape or sexual assault cases before a tribal court. In order for an IHS official or BIA officer to answer a subpoena to testify in court, approval must be given by someone in Washington, D.C. The result is that some tribal court criminal cases are dropped because the person who conducted the rape examination or the officer who answered the distress call doesn't show up in tribal court. That would be changed so that if approval isn't given within 30 days, the request to testify will be considered approved. By expanding training programs to grant tribal law enforcement officers authority to arrest all suspects of crime on tribal land and making it easier for IHS experts to testify in court, we can slow the flood of crimes that go unpunished. While there will be no simple or quick fix, this comprehensive legislation is a step in the right direction. By passing this legislation, we'll make important strides in improving law enforcement in Indian country during this Congress. I thank you again, Chairman Scott, for this opportunity to testify on behalf of the Tribal Law and Order Act of 2009 and for helping to advance this important bill on behalf of the tribal communities across Indian country that are in desperate need of improved law enforcement.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any questions? Thank you. We will be proceeding with the next panel. Thank you for your sponsorship of this, Ms. Herseth Sandlin. And